Hello, Mason Storm here. Asparagus is one of my favorite vegetables and you can eat it in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways I've had it recently that I really liked was pickled. So I'm going to demonstrate how to pickle your asparagus. 1 teaspoon of cayenne pepper powder, 1 teaspoon of mustard powder, 1 teaspoon of celery seed, 1 teaspoon of dill, teaspoon of onion powder, half a teaspoon of salt, 1/4 cup of sugar, a package of asparagus, and I like to go even split of vinegar and water. So I have 2 cups of each. So we're going to start by preparing our asparagus. And to do that, I've already washed it and I got my jar here. Now we want to cut our asparagus so that it's about 3/4 of an inch from the top of the jar, a couple centimeters. That way it's all nice and submerged in our pickling bath. And you also want to make sure that the tips of your asparagus are cut off as well. They're all hard and they don't really taste that great. So we're going to have 3 parts. We're going to have the top floret part, and we're going to have the shaft part that's still good edible stuff, and then the bottom tip, which is the stuff we want to get rid of. And I'm kind of separating the two here. You don't necessarily have to do that. And I think kind of probably the best way to do this would have been to just use the top floury portions and then use the stalks that are a little bit further down or whatever in like a different recipe. Maybe make a stir fry with them or something. But I ended up pickling it all anyway, and it tasted fine. It's just when you pull them out of the jar, it's a stalk doesn't look very exciting. It just is green and long. So, but you can use it all. Just the tips that you want to make sure you get rid of. Kind of the white portion that's not the greatest. And before you know it, you'll have all of your asparagus cut up. Over at our stove top, I'm going to be using 2 different pots. One for doing sterilization and the pickling process, and the other for making the pickling solution. And now we're going to make our pickling solution, and it's quite simple really. We simply add in all of our ingredients into the pot before letting it come to a rolling boil. And we're going to let it boil for probably 5 or 10 minutes, something like that. You don't want it to all boil away, but you can kind of boil it for a pretty long time. But if it starts to go down and level and you need a little bit more juice, simply add more vinegar and water at the same ratio as, well, whatever your preferred ratio is. If you want to do 2/3 to 1 or 1 to 1 like I do, it's up to you. On the other side of the stove, I have my pot, and I'm going to add in my jar and my jar lid. I'm going to let them boil for a while till they get all nice and sterilized. It doesn't really take all that long, probably 3 minutes or something. So once you have both kind of going at the same time, you have your sterilized jar and boiling pickling solution. Time to move on to our next step. So now we got our jar all prepared, so it's time to add in our asparagus. And remember, we want to keep the leafy side or whatever at the top. It took me several attempts to figure out a way to get all of these inside of the jar, but eventually I was able to do it. It turned out that doing a few at a time and throwing in some of the stems or whatever in between, it was possible to get it done. So now we simply need to add in our pickling juice. So we're going to do that through the top, and I'm actually going to be using this funnel, which I think is for canning. It fits the jars perfectly. But you don't really need to have one. You can just use the old-fashioned spoon and take your time. In fact, if you take your time, you'll probably spill less of it than I did. But it won't take long if you speed up the footage and cut out the time in between, and eventually it'll fill up. Now I had like the perfect amount of brine for this. It was just crazy. And you want to leave a little bit of room on the top of your jar, probably 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch or something like that. And then throw our lid on it, now that the lid's all been sterilized as well in the boiling water. Although we're not quite done yet. So now we're back at our boiling water. Ideally you'd want to fully submerge this jar of stuff, but my pot's not quite deep enough. And you don't really want it sitting on the very bottom of the pot either, because I can crack the glass. So I like to throw down a bunch of spoons or forks and then set the jar on top of it. And what we're going to do now is simply boil it for 10 minutes. And it's going to stick out, so it's just going to kind of do the bottom of it. So this isn't like the perfect canning technique, But this is good enough to get you some pretty good, tasty pickled asparagus, but not something that you can throw in the cellar for 7 years and expect to survive the consumption of. Maybe get botulism or something. Either way, once our time is allotted, we simply pull out our asparagus in the jar and we throw it on a cooling rack, and once it cools off, you'll notice that the bottom button on the jar sticks down. That means there's a vacuum inside so that it's sealed, and that's all good. So probably leave it 3 or 4 days before you open it up and start eating it, but I left mine for a week and they're pretty darn good. It's probably one of my favorite pickled things to consume. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite type of pickle is. Eggs are probably my number 2. Any questions or concerns, leave them below as well. If you like my content, please like and subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome.